Picture this. You're standing in the marble corridors of a Roman villa at dusk. Oil lamps flicker, casting shifting shadows across frescoed walls. Behind thin fabric partitions, you catch murmured voices, Adamina and her slave girls whispering about the next day's beauty rituals. The air is thick with the scent of rose oil, burning incense, and something else, something faintly metallic and strange. A senator's wife steps out from her private chambers. Her skin is powdered with toxic white lead, her lips tinted with mercury-based rouge, cosmetics that, over time, will quietly poison her. She glides toward her husband's study, where honored guests await, her movements graceful, but burdened with customs so foreign to modern life, they feel like hallucinations rather than historical fact. Before we dive deeper into these buried tales of survival, control, and ritual, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden sides of history, hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's surreal, exploring stories from ancient times together, spread across the world yet united by the same curiosity. What we consider intimacy today, private moments, grooming routines, family bonds, existed in ancient Rome under radically different rules. These weren't strange outliers, but foundational aspects of society, upheld by religion, law, and tradition. A world where gender, power, and sexuality followed logic that would shock and disturb us in equal measure. In 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius blanketed Pompeii in volcanic ash, it froze more than buildings and corpses in time. It preserved glimpses into the most private Roman behaviors. Archaeologists uncovered bedrooms adorned with explicit frescoes, bathhouses governed by complex social codes, and private quarters where boundaries between pleasure, dominance, and humiliation melted away. Take the Roman virtue of pudicitia, loosely translated as chastity or modesty, but it meant far more. For elite Roman women, pudicitia wasn't merely sexual restraint. It was a social balancing act, remaining accessible only to one's husband while staying entirely off-limits to all other men. This wasn't a personal choice, it reflected her husband's status and political dignity. Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, perfected this image of virtue so convincingly that she became the ideal Roman woman. But in private, she allegedly operated an intelligence web of slave girls embedded in aristocratic homes, extracting gossip about the private affairs of Rome's elite. She knew well. In Roman politics, information from the bedroom could carry more weight than Senate decrees. Marriage among Rome's elite rarely had anything to do with love. It was strategy, a business transaction between families aimed at consolidating property, political ties, and producing legitimate heirs. Affection, if it came, was a happy accident. Often, the wedding night was the first moment bride and groom had real privacy, and the pressure to seal the deal was enormous. In a letter from 97 AD, Pliny the Younger recounts a wedding night between two noble families. The bride, only 14, was trembling as her mother and aunts dressed her in ceremony. In the next room, her husband, a man 2 decades older, waited. Elder women explained what was about to happen, using words the girl barely understood. The bed, sanctified by household gods and cloaked in deep red fabric, was prepared to conceal the blood expected from her first sexual act. Roman sexual categories weren't divided simply into male and female. They revolved around an intricate social hierarchy. Citizenship, slave status, foreign origin, all of it defined a person's sexual rights and roles. A male Roman citizen could sleep with slaves, sex workers, or foreigners without stigma. But laying with the wife or daughter of another citizen, that was a political and legal minefield. Gaius Silius learned this the hard way in 48 AD, when he dared to marry Valeria Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, while Claudius was absent from Rome. Whether the union was technically valid didn't matter. It symbolized an attack on imperial dignity. When Claudius returned, both were swiftly executed, not purely for adultery, but for daring to disturb the state's power structure through sexual rebellion. Slavery added another sinister layer to Roman intimacy. Enslaved bodies were seen as extensions of their master's will, tools to be used, including sexually, with no legal protection or consent required. Wealthy households often owned slaves for specific intimate roles, those skilled in cosmetics, the cubiculariae for bedroom service, and concubines who existed alongside lawful spouses. Marcus Crassus, among the richest men in 1st century BC, Rome, reportedly kept over 500 slaves just in his city residence. Dozens were selected for their beauty and trained in arts that blurred the lines between servant, performer, and sex object. Ancient texts allude to evening rituals, lavish gatherings where slaves not only played instruments or recited poetry, but participated in acts far more intimate, under the guise of household entertainment or divine homage. Even Roman bathhouses weren't just about hygiene, they were buzzing centers of social and sexual life. Most baths were segregated by gender, but interaction still happened in shared zones, often preludes to secret rendezvous. These spaces allowed for encounters that spanned from flirtation to outright solicitation. Seneca the Younger, writing around 60 AD, vented about the racket coming from the bathhouse below his apartment, the clang of weightlifting, the rhythmic smacking during massages, the yelps of people being plucked with tweezers. And beneath it all, the murmurs of private deals between bathers and attendants offering services too taboo for signage. His annoyance paints a clear picture. Sexual commerce was so normalized it became part of the background noise of daily Roman life. The Roman obsession with body hair bordered on religious. Among the elite, both men and women submitted to torturous methods of depilation. Burning hot tweezers, waxes made from pine resin, and even pumice stones scraped across skin to grind away unwanted hair. Smoothness signaled refinement. Pain was the price of beauty and status. Among the many roles slaves held in elite Roman households, some were assigned the singular task of hair removal. These specialists were known as ali pilarii. Their job was to strip their mistresses of every strand of body hair using painfully crude methods. Martial, the Spanish-born poet, writing in the 1st century AD, once described witnessing such a scene. A senator's wife lay perfectly still while her young slave girl plucked hair from her limbs and more intimate places, using heated bronze tweezers. The noblewoman maintained the composed expression expected of a Roman matron, even as silent tears streamed down her face. She never uttered a sound. When the hours-long ordeal ended, her skin was inflamed and bleeding, but smooth as dictated by high-status fashion. Roman beauty standards came at a deadly cost. The cosmetics favoured by upper-class women were filled with poisons. Their iconic pale complexion came from face paint made of lead carbonate, a substance that, over time, caused infertility, nerve damage, and premature death. Vibrant red lips and cheeks were achieved using mercury-based rouge, which slowly corroded the nervous system. Kohl eyeliners were laced with antimony and other toxic metals. Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria from around 2 AD, laid out beauty instructions that now read like fatal alchemy. Mix white lead with vinegar to form a paste, he advised. Then spread it thickly across the face and neck. For lip colour, crush cinnabar with rose oil and animal fat. Line the eyes with antimony, blended with honey and wine. Women following such recipes were quite literally painting themselves to death, sacrificing years of health for social approval. Contraceptive and abortive methods in ancient Rome were just as dangerous. They relied on toxic plants, harmful minerals, and physically risky procedures. Silphium, a now extinct herb harvested from North Africa, was once so prized for its contraceptive powers that it appeared on Cyrenian currency and was traded at the price of silver. Though effective, its potency made overdoses common and often fatal. Cyranus of Ephesus, a Greek physician practicing in Rome during the 2nd century AD, recorded various attempts women made to avoid pregnancy. Some inserted tufts of wool soaked in vinegar, honey, or cedar resin. Others ingested concoctions containing copper sulfate, rusted iron, or even crushed beetles. Some turned to violent exercise, scalding baths, or deliberate injury in hopes of preventing conception. Though written in cold medical prose, Soranus's work reflects the quiet desperation of women willing to risk their lives to control their bodies in a society offering little legal or social recourse. Abortion was legal under Roman law. The fetus was seen as part of the woman's body, not a separate being, but the available procedures were brutal and often lethal. Women drank infusions of pennyroyal, rue, and savin, which worked by poisoning the entire body to force a miscarriage. Others turned to surgical intervention. Bronze instruments were inserted into the womb, often resulting in bleeding, infection, or permanent internal damage. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History written around 77 AD, described watching a wealthy woman attempt to end an unwanted pregnancy. She had been consuming herbs for days without success, growing weaker and increasingly desperate. Finally, a Greek physician inserted metal tools while her relatives held her down and she bit into a leather strap. The pregnancy ended, but she succumbed to infection days later. Her family, unwilling to admit the truth, told others she had died of a sudden fever. Roman views on same-sex relations followed complex hierarchies more than concepts of emotional attraction. Male-male relationships were common and even celebrated, but only if the dominant role was held by the Roman citizen. A man could freely penetrate slaves, foreigners, or those beneath him in status without scandal, but taking the passive role, regardless of consent or affection, brought disgrace. Julius Caesar was hounded throughout his career by accusations that, in his youth, he had been the passive lover of King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia. His enemies mocked him as the Queen of Bithynia, suggesting that his later military exploits were attempts to erase the shame of that relationship. The truth was irrelevant. The insult stuck because in Roman culture, to be sexually submissive was to be politically weak. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with the young Antinous was tolerated not because it was same-sex, but because Hadrian's public mourning crossed into emotional excess. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 30 AD, Hadrian's grief was so intense that he declared the boy a god and founded a city in his name. To many Romans, this display undermined the ideal of imperial masculinity, not because of the nature of the relationship, but because Hadrian appeared too emotionally entangled to maintain dominance. Prostitution in Rome was legal, taxed, and heavily stratified. Different kinds of sex workers occupied different rungs of the social ladder. Meretresses were registered prostitutes who worked in official brothels and paid taxes. Ancillae were slave women whose owners profited by leasing out their bodies. Famaci were once respectable women who had fallen into disgrace, often through adultery, and resorted to informal prostitution to survive. Excavations in Pompeii unearthed well-preserved brothels, small stone rooms barely big enough for a narrow bed, walls decorated with explicit frescoes depicting services and prices. Graffiti left behind by clients tells a surprisingly human story. Some entries simply name girls or record crude satisfaction. Others show tenderness, one man wrote. Restituta, you moved your hips so sweetly, capturing a moment of intimacy that transcended the transaction. The Suburra, a densely packed neighborhood in Rome, was home to the city's largest red light district, full of taverns, brothels, and theaters. Wealthy men often visited in disguise, cloaked in rough garments to avoid being recognized. Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century AD, describes senators and even priests sneaking through its streets, indulging in pleasures by night that they condemned by day. They arrived after nightfall, having swapped their togas for coarse tunics, their senatorial rings tucked away in hidden pouches. By morning, they returned to their grand villas and respectable lives, as if the night's indulgences belonged to another realm, governed by different deities. Marriage contracts among Rome's elite often resembled detailed legal agreements more than declarations of love. Preserved on papyrus scrolls and bronze plaques, these documents laid out not only dowries and inheritance terms, but also clauses concerning sexual conduct, including the expected frequency of intercourse, acceptable contraceptives, and penalties for infidelity. A contract dated to 1004 AD between two noble families includes this line: "The wife shall comply with her husband's sexual requests no fewer than twice each week, barring illness, menstruation, or ritual purification." Unusual requests may only be denied if they cause harm or require third-party involvement. Non-compliance shall result in monetary deductions from her dowry. Roman wedding nights were steeped in symbolic rituals meant to ensure fertility and harmony. Brides were lifted over the threshold to block evil spirits from entering through their souls. Their hair was combed with a spear once used in combat, often to kill a gladiator, a symbol of the bravery required in childbirth. The conjugal bed was consecrated by one marriage-only matrons with living children, as young boys scattered nuts and fruit to invite fertility. In a wedding hymn written by Catullus for Junia and Manlius around 60 BC, the bride sits silently as elder women strip her of her childhood attire and clothe her in the saffron robe of matrimony. Her face is painted with sacred clay, her hair wrapped in ribbons blessed by household gods. Her tears are not of sorrow, but of fear, for she is stepping into an unknown world. In the next room, the groom drinks wine with his male kin, who offer a mix of crude advice and solemn warnings about his conjugal obligations before sunrise. Among the upper classes, divorce could be initiated by either partner with a simple declaration. But while men faced little stigma and could remarry freely, women often endured social exile, the loss of their children, and financial ruin. Since Roman law typically awarded property to the husband, Augustus attempted to reform marriage through the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus in 18 BC. The law penalized bachelors and men who divorced without valid cause, effectively mandating marriage. But rather than strengthening families, it spawned an underground market for fake unions and clever legal dodges. Some men married slaves only to free them instantly, others wed distant foreigners and never saw them again. Roman religious festivals often incorporated shocking elements of sexual display. The Floralia, held every April in honor of the goddess Flora, featured nudity, lewd stage performances, and public intercourse thought to encourage agricultural prosperity. Respectable matrons typically stayed away, but prostitutes, freedwomen, and slaves participated with gusto. Martial, writing in 88 AD, described the Floralia theatre packed with citizens who condemned such scenes at home, yet roared approval as naked dancers mimicked sex acts on stage. Senators sat beside their servants, all pretending that it was religious obligation, not voyeurism, that brought them there. Flora was believed to bless those who shed their modesty completely, and the crowd was eager to prove itself worthy. Roman medical writings combine anatomical insight with deeply ingrained gender and class assumptions. Physicians like Galen wrote extensively on the body and sexuality, but their advice often reflected social beliefs more than science. They asserted that women must feel pleasure to conceive, but too much pleasure could render them morally unstable. Soranus of Ephesus, a gynecologist practicing in Rome, offered birthing advice that exposed the cultural link between passion and reproduction. If labor was stalled, midwives were instructed to ask whether the mother had enjoyed conception, for desire was thought to open the womb. If not, herbal or manual intervention might be needed. Women impregnated by duty or assault, he noted, tended to suffer longer labors, while those conceived in passion gave birth more easily. Sexual education in Rome was less formal and more experiential. Boys were taught by fathers, tutors, and first-hand exposure to slaves. Girls, on the other hand, were guided by mothers and married women, but their training focused on obedience and endurance, not autonomy or pleasure. Rites of passage, like the toga virilis ceremony at age 16, marked a boy's transition into manhood. This included sacrifices, public declarations, and private talks on sexual conduct. Archaeological evidence suggests that these talks often culminated in supervised visits to brothels or prearranged liaisons with household slaves. Roman poetry gives us rare insight into the emotional contradictions of this world. Catullus, writing passionately about his affair with Lesbia, thought to be Clodia Metelli, sister to a powerful politician, oscillated between romantic ecstasy and violent resentment. His verses reveal that despite societal norms that prioritized marriage over love, Romans experienced intense emotional connections. But even in these poetic outpourings, power dynamics are never far. Catullus praises Lesbia's charm and wit when their love is fresh. But once betrayed, his language grows cruel and violent, threatening sexual revenge against her male lovers as a way to reassert dominance. In Rome, love and authority were often intertwined. Tenderness could quickly curdle into brutality when hierarchies were disturbed. Even Roman death customs reflect how sexuality and intimacy were believed to extend beyond the grave. Tombs of the wealthy often depicted married couples reclining side by side, the woman's hand placed over her husband's heart, a symbol of everlasting loyalty. These monuments served as a message that love and sexual union transcended mortality. Some burial chambers went further, featuring erotic frescoes and containing objects clearly linked to intimate use. Whether these gestures were sincere hopes for afterlife pleasures or simply a reflection of the deceased's worldly tastes is still debated. Roman attitudes toward aging and sex contrast sharply with modern ideals. Older men were expected to remain sexually vigorous, and many married young wives specifically to maintain a satisfying sex life into advanced age. Older women in Rome faced a different set of expectations. Widows were often encouraged to remarry for social and financial reasons. But if a postmenopausal woman showed signs of sexual desire, society mocked her as desperate or inappropriate. Juvenal ridiculed elderly women who pursued younger lovers. One such case was Ippia, a grandmother of 7 who abandoned her husband to follow a gladiator to Egypt. Her face, lined with age, was painted like a young bride's, her sagging body wrapped in silk that fooled no one. The gladiator gladly took her jewelry and coin, but when she reached for him in their shared lodgings, he recoiled, muttering that some coins were too costly to earn. Roman slavery created emotional and intimate bonds that existed in a legal grey zone. Slaves weren't permitted to marry, yet they often formed deep attachments, acknowledged informally within households. In some cases, masters freed beloved slaves to marry them, but such unions were still shaped by the unequal power that had formed them. Children born to enslaved women were considered the property of the master, no matter who fathered them, meaning entire families could be broken apart at a whim. Pliny the Younger once wrote about his slave Zosimus in a letter to a friend. He was more than a servant. He was my companion. He shared my bed, my meals, my thoughts. When illness struck him, I personally tended to him rather than assign others. His death left a void in my household that no one can fill. Pliny freed Zosimus's son and had a tomb built in his honor, inscribed not as property but as a cherished friend. Though, as Pliny admitted, many would likely consider such affection inappropriate for a mere slave. Roman law allowed for multiple types of marriage, each with its own legal weight. Conferatio was the most formal, reserved for patricians, involving intricate religious rites that made divorce nearly impossible. Coemptio mimicked a purchase, symbolically transferring the bride from her father's control to her husband's. Usus was the most informal. If a woman lived with a man for one uninterrupted year without being away for more than 3 nights in a row, they were deemed legally married. These varied marriage types created a wide spectrum of intimate partnerships, each offering different levels of legal and social recognition. Elite families typically preferred conferatio marriages for their children to secure legitimacy and inheritance, while the poor often relied on usus, unofficial unions requiring no ceremony but offering fewer protections. Many Roman sexual customs were ordinary in their own time, but appear disturbing to us today. One such practice was pederasty, sexual relationships between grown men and adolescent boys. These were not only tolerated, but celebrated, provided strict rules were followed. The older man was expected to be the active partner and serve as the youth's intellectual and moral mentor. Such relationships were viewed as educational rather than predatory, though from a modern standpoint, it's clear they carry dangerous imbalances of power and the potential for lasting harm. Roman literature offers intimate portraits of such bonds. In Petronius's Satyricon Harca, 60 AD, the narrator confesses his tormented passion for his young lover Giton. His beauty brought me more pain than joy. I longed to possess not only his body, but his thoughts, his dreams. But when other men gazed at him with lust, I felt not pride, but panic that someone might steal what I thought was mine. Love blurred into ownership, and I could no longer say whether I was Gaiton's protector or his captor. Roman religion also wove sexuality into sacred rituals. Some temples used sacred prostitutes, viewed as intermediaries between mortals and gods. The cult of Cybele, popular among merchants and soldiers, featured dramatic rites in which male priests castrated themselves in frenzied devotion, thereafter living as women and serving the goddess. These galli, as they were called, existed outside the usual bounds, neither male nor female, neither citizen nor slave, but something sacred and unclassifiable. Roman magic frequently targeted matters of desire and sexual control. Archaeologists have uncovered curse tablets begging divine aid in matters of love and lust. I bind Gaius Lucius so that his thoughts belong only to Claudia, that he may neither eat nor sleep nor find peace until he lies in her bed. Love potions, made from herbs and animal parts, were commonly sold, despite being illegal. The line between medicine, sorcery, and poison was hazy, and many Romans died after consuming concoctions meant to heighten arousal or allure. Roman views on pleasure varied sharply by gender. Men were expected to seek out and enjoy sexual pleasure so long as they maintained social dominance. Women, on the other hand, were supposed to enjoy sex only enough to conceive, not so much that they appeared unchaste or insatiable. This created a tightrope. Many Roman women walked in fear. Too little passion made them seem cold, too much made them scandalous. Ovid's Amores, Car, 15 BC, describes one such moment. She lay beneath me, unmoving, a statue fulfilling her duty. She feared passion would brand her as wanton. But when I ceased my effort, she wept, fearing her coldness had failed to satisfy me. Roman wives had to navigate between the Scylla of excessive lust and the Charybdis of frigidity. Many wrecked on one shore or the other. Sexuality among slaves was strictly managed. Masters could prevent slave marriages, split up families, or grant sexual access as a reward or punishment. Some even ran breeding programs, documented on surviving wax tablets and papyri that listed slaves' traits and reproductive value like livestock. These records paint a chilling picture of how completely the Romans reduced people to property. Military life in Rome reflected the same harsh dynamics. Though soldiers were expected to stay celibate during campaigns, this rule was routinely broken through rape, concubinage, and coerced relationships with locals. Conquest often ended in mass sexual violence. In Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, he alludes to the aftermath of the siege of Alesia. The legions marks their victory in the old ways. The captive women were assigned, some as servants, others for uses that military order forbade, but which victory allowed. That night, the cries from the camp blended with songs of celebration, a discordant chorus echoing Rome's twin legacy, civilizer and destroyer. Roman cities were shaped by gendered and sexual expectations. Public spaces were divided by sex, women and men entering through separate doors, occupying distinct areas. Private homes were similarly structured, every room signaling who belonged and who did not. The innermost chambers, where sexual activity took place, were often adorned with frescoes and mosaics that celebrated themes of fertility, pleasure, and occasionally violence. Roman roads, renowned for their engineering brilliance, also enabled the movement of individuals involved in sexual commerce. Prostitutes, entertainers, and enslaved people traveled these highways between cities, drawn by festivals, military campaigns, and economic opportunity. Roadside inns frequently doubled as brothels, where traveling merchants expected to find sexual services as readily as they would food or shelter. The Roman legal system laid out extensive rules governing sexual behavior, reflecting the state's vested interest in regulating reproduction, reinforcing hierarchies, and safeguarding public order. These laws dictated which sexual acts were permitted, who could engage in them, and what consequences awaited those who transgressed. They were less about protecting individual rights or preventing harm, and more about preserving the social structures that sustained Rome's power and stability. Rome's taxation policies recognized the profitability of sexual commerce. Prostitutes were required to pay fees for registration and taxes on their earnings. Brothel proprietors owed additional levies on their establishments. Even private citizens caught in acts of adultery could face fines that enriched the imperial treasury. Sex in Rome wasn't merely a private act, it functioned as a state-regulated industry contributing directly to the empire's economic strength. Architectural innovations in Rome also accounted for sexual activities. Bathhouses featured secluded rooms where private meetings could occur discreetly. Theatres had upper levels where sexual encounters were widely assumed, if not officially acknowledged. Certain temples included spaces where worshippers could engage in sexual rituals believed to please the gods they revered. Artistic traditions in Rome preserved visual depictions of sex that today might be seen as pornographic, but were once ordinary domestic decor. Frescoes, mosaics, sculptures, and ornamental objects vividly illustrated sexual acts with startling openness. These artifacts suggest a culture far more at ease with visual representations of intimacy than most later European societies would become. Roman philosophers wrestled with questions of sex, pleasure, and human behavior that remain compelling today. Stoics generally promoted self-discipline, viewing unrestrained desire as a weakness that clouded reason. Epicureans were more accepting of pleasure, but advised caution, urging one to pursue only those pleasures that would not result in pain. Marcus Aurelius, Rome's philosopher king, struggled to reconcile his bodily desires with Stoic restraint. The body seeks pleasure like water finds its level, flowing toward ease and indulgence. The mind must act as a dam, not to stop the flow entirely, but to guide it toward what benefits the whole. Desire is not shameful, but like fire, if uncontrolled, it consumes all in its path. Roman medicine offered a mix of accurate anatomical insights and cultural biases that sometimes made treatment dangerous. Physicians understood key aspects of reproduction and developed surgeries for sexual injuries or disease. Yet diagnoses and prescriptions were often colored by ideas about gender roles, class status, and morality. In agriculture, beliefs about human sexuality influenced planting and harvest rituals. Farmers timed these tasks to align with their own sexual activity, believing that fertility could be transferred from humans to crops through sympathetic magic. Agricultural texts even included instructions on how couples should behave sexually during various seasons to promote abundance. Entertainment in Rome was steeped in eroticism, not merely as an afterthought, but as a key attraction. Gladiator games, theatre productions, chariot races, and public festivities all incorporated sexual elements that satisfied the audience's craving for both spectacle and titillation. Performers often served double roles, as entertainers and sex workers, while the venues became known places to seek erotic encounters. Literary works from Rome offer intimate glimpses into the emotional realities of navigating a complex web of sexual norms. Poets such as Catullus, Ovid, Propertius, and Martial wrote pieces that were both deeply personal and broadly reflective, exposing how Romans experienced love, lust, jealousy, and heartbreak within their cultural framework. Roman religious syncretism absorbed sexual practices from conquered peoples into its rituals. Traditions from Egypt, Greece, Syria, and Germania introduced beliefs and ceremonies that both enriched and disrupted Roman sexual norms. Mystery cults devoted to gods like Mithras, Isis, and Dionysus often embraced alternative sexual ideals that clashed with Rome's conventional morality. In economic terms, sexual services were treated as legitimate business. Prostitution, concubinage, and other intimate exchanges were regulated, taxed, and in some cases, legally protected. This pragmatic view of sex as commerce influenced Roman law and policy as much, if not more, than religious or moral principles ever could. Sex could also be a ladder or a trap in the realm of Roman social mobility. Enslaved individuals, particularly those valued for their beauty, might gain freedom through sexual ties to their masters. Freeborn citizens, meanwhile, could lose status and reputation due to scandal or perceived impropriety. Marriage alliances could elevate entire lineages, while illicit sex could bring exile, disgrace, or death. Roman innovations extended to sexual technology. Archaeological digs have unearthed intimate items crafted from bronze, glass, and organic substances, some used to enhance pleasure, others intended to prevent conception or remedy dysfunction. Roman pharmacology featured formulas aimed at stimulating libido, increasing fertility, or reducing desire, showing a sophisticated, if sometimes misguided, understanding of sexual health. Colonial policy in Rome systematically used sexual violence as a tool of dominance and control. Conquered populations were expected to adopt Roman sexual norms, yet denied the legal protections granted to Roman citizens. Administrators often took local women as concubines, producing mixed heritage populations that further complicated the empire's social and legal hierarchies. Even death didn't sever Rome's ties between sex and society. Inscriptions on tombs celebrated marital unions that were expected to continue in the afterlife. Grave goods sometimes included items tied to intimacy. Funeral rituals could feature sexual elements thought to ensure vitality or fertility even in death. Now imagine yourself back in that marble hallway where we began. But this time, you truly understand the meaning behind those whispered exchanges. The beauty routines that quietly poisoned aristocratic women, the marriage contracts that treated reproduction like livestock breeding, the enslaved bodies used without consent, the children wed before they understood what marriage meant, the intricate social rules that dictated who could touch whom, how, and when. Roman civilization gave us laws, literature, and enduring monuments, but it also constructed deeply unequal systems of intimate life built on coercion, hierarchy, and control. The Romans were not monsters. They were human, shaped by cultural assumptions that seemed as natural to them as ours do to us. The ash that preserved Pompeii did more than freeze a city. It preserved a reflection, showing us that power and desire have always been entangled. The bodies found there, preserved in their final postures, remind us that the past may not be as distant as we believe. We've simply learned to disguise the same dynamics with more polished language and subtler rituals. Their whispers still reach us, not in Latin, but in the universal language of longing distorted by cruelty. They tell us that intimacy has never been untouched by power, that love has always been shaped by control, and that every society reveals its soul through its sexual customs, by who it allows to be fully human and who it does not. And standing in those ruins, if you listen closely, you might still hear the echoes. Secrets buried, not silenced. Customs changed, but never erased. As persistent and as complicated as the human heart itself.